time to have another interesting conversation. And well, if you are a regular viewer of the show, you know him. Today I have him in studio with me, Dr. John Osae-Kwapong. Good to have you.
Thank you very much.
How are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Right. Okay, so Doc is a regular on our show. He shares his thoughts on many socio-political issues that we discuss here on the AM show. But guess what? He's about to launch a book. And the title in itself is interesting. It tells you there's so much to get in that copy. And here's the title: 5 presidents, 8 elections, 30 years later. How Ghanaians see their democracy. My first question to you, before we talk about the details of the launch and how people can get copies, is how do Ghanaians see their democracy? Is it getting any better in their eyes?
Well, Ghanaians see their democracy in a number of ways. So there are the things that they like about their democracy. So, and the book is based solely on the Afrobarometer survey. So here I try to summarize 9 rounds of Afrobarometer, which started in 1999. And so the positive ways in which they see their democracy is around things like their strong support for democracy. So 30 years later, at least you have about 8 out of 10 Ghanaians still saying democracy is preferable to any other form of government. Ghanaians also have very positive attitudes towards some of the things that comes with democracy. So a majority believe that we must choose our leaders regularly through elections. We strongly disapprove of non-democratic forms of government. So Afrobarometer does ask, do you disapprove of one-man rule, one-party rule, military rule? And again, you have strong majorities who disapprove of those types of government. And then the last positive way in which they view their democracy is the fact that they also believe in oversight and accountability, as well as term limits. So those are, for me, the positive ways in which Ghanaians view their democracy. The things that, or the other ways in which they are not viewing their democracy very positively has to do, for me, the biggest one for me is the lack of trust in the institutions that make democracy work. And over time, you actually do see that trust going down. So it's a mixed bag. Ghanaians see their democracy, some aspects of it, in a positive way, but they also see some aspects of their democracy in not so positive ways. That makes you realize that there are still some challenges as we work to
what are the concerns about the institutions that are expected to help facilitate the democratic process? What are the exact concerns? So
the institutions face 2 major issues. One of it is trust. So the question in Afrobarometer says, to what extent do you trust? And then it lists a number of institutions: the presidency, parliament, courts, traditional rulers, ruling parties, opposition political parties, the media. So there's a whole list of the Electoral Commission, right? So there's a whole list of institutions. And the options respondents have include a lot. So for me, my focus is on the percentage of Ghanaians who say they trust these institutions a lot, because then that's the highest form of trust that one can, repose in a given institution. And over time, you do see that levels of trust actually declining. So that's the first major issue that is faced in our institutions, the lack of trust. That is further complicated by an increasing perception of corruption among institutions. So on the corruption question, Afrobarometer says, how many of the people in these institutions do you think are involved in corruption? And again, same list of institutions. The responses go from none of them to all of them. The way I use that data is to say, I want as many people to say none of them. Because if you view an institution as none of the people in there are involved in corruption, it means that's a really quote-unquote clean institution. And more, we are seeing really low levels of, the percentage of Ghanaians who are willing to give our institutions what I call a clean bill of health. So if you combine the lack of trust with an increasing perception of corruption, that becomes for me a troubling recipe for institutions. The last thing I would add to that is, it is also further complicated by partisanship.
Right.
So if you look at particularly the issue of trust and you break it down by which party do you feel close to, you notice that when a person's preferred political party is in power, they have slightly better levels of trust in an institution than when their party is in opposition.
So it means the institutions aren't independent in the minds of the people.
Precisely.
I can only trust it if the people I voted for are at the helm of affairs.
And that's worrying because it shouldn't matter, right, whether the party I voted for in an election, won or not. Right? If I have a dispute with my neighbor and I want to take them to court, or I want the courts to resolve that dispute, I want to believe that my courts would act impartially in arbitrating that dispute. And therefore, for me, I find it worrying that I only have a better level of trust when I know that it's my preferred political party in power as opposed to when they are in opposition. So that, for me, is one of the biggest challenges that I believe, as we move forward to deepen democratic governance in this country, we would have to work on. Whatever it is that institutions do or do not do to fuel this mistrust and this growing perception, that something must be done to rectify that.
And I must say, you've done a very good job summarizing the Afrobarometer report, because 8 elections and this size of book. So for those of you who struggle to read really large documents, this is going to help you a lot. But tell me what prompted you to embark on this project.
So I'd started doing my own work with the Afrobarometer survey. And then in May 2016, I was in Ghana on a visit. I gave a public lecture using Afrobarometer data. Back then, they had only about, I think, 6 rounds of the survey. And so after the public lecture, I said, it would be really nice to try and come up with a narrative that captures, everything that I'm seeing in Afrobarometer as to how Ghanaians are feeling about our democracy journey. Of course, so I started working on it in 2017, and then I would stop, go, and then there was another round of Afrobarometer, another round. We had 2 more elections, we had another president, and so the timing is just perfect because we are starting to also reflect on 30 years, of our journey for democratic governance. So that's how it all started. It's taking, 6 years to complete the project, but I'm glad that is finally done and I can launch it today.
All right. So tell us when the launch is happening, how people can be a part of it, and how, most importantly, we can get copies of the book.
Yes, so we are going to launch this today, 3 o'clock, at the CDD-Ghana main conference room in airport. We would stream it on our handle, so on Facebook, YouTube as well. We would tweet about it. So I'll let Kingsley have what the actual Twitter handles is going to be. You can get a copy on Amazon, but you can also get a copy on Book Nook, store by Nanaire Damwa. And so, we were in Tamale. I was in Tamale on Tuesday. I'll be in Kumasi on Tuesday as well.
Okay, so people can, in Kumasi, yes. Where will you be?
In Kumasi, I'll be at the Ashanti Regional Library from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock on Tuesday.
On Tuesday? Okay, so please, if you want to see Dr. Osae-Kwapong, he's ready to meet you and get an autograph or a photograph. And as he releases this book. But Doc, I mean, when we talk about democracy, there's just one thing that comes up so strongly, and in recent times it's come up again about whether or not we should not define democracy on our own terms instead of a copy and paste that we have done since the inception of our democracy, because we copied a certain system that some have argued is not native to the African traditional setup, okay? And so they say, let's define it in our terms. Let's do it in a way that will satisfy our needs. Because, to be fair, these democracies that we compare ourselves to are hundreds of years older than ours, okay? And so it's almost as if it's not fair, for example, if someone wanted to compare Ghana's democracy to the US democracy now, because it has come a long way.
Precisely.
And unfortunately, we don't have the privilege of seeing what it looked like at 60-something years old.
Right.
You get my point.
Precisely.
And then there are those who also say that probably democracy is not synonymous to development. And the lack of democracy does not necessarily mean military rule. So you look at places like Saudi Arabia where they have their own system of governance and they seem to be doing so well. I mean, in wrapping up the conversation, just your quick thoughts on these because of the focus of democracy.
Right. So, in fact, in the first page of the book, I have a quote by the late Professor Kwame Gyekye. And this is how he defined democracy. He was writing a book called Tradition and Modernity, Reflections on the African Experience. And he says that he thinks it means the form of practice of democracy derives from a people's historical and cultural experiences, right? And ultimately, it's something that we are also prepared to defend, no matter what. And so he highlights that idea that whatever system of government you come up with, especially a democracy, that it must take into consideration what our history has been, as well as what our cultural identities also look at. So that's very important, right? But I also think that democracy is a journey. It's never a finished thing. You can never say, we went from point A to point B, now we have a democracy and it's done. No, it's a work in progress. I mean, the US, several years later, there are still issues that are still coming up. The courts are still getting involved in resolving certain fundamental questions about what the practice of all the different rights that people fight over, the role of government, things like that. And then to the last point about the link between democracy and development. What all the evidence points to is that over time, democracies tend to do better. They tend to develop, they tend to produce more positive development outcomes. There's also the corrective mechanism in a democracy, right? That if you are dissatisfied with a particular government performance, right? At least in a democracy, you have voice, you have accountability. And therefore, that is why it becomes the environment in which one would prefer to have in order to achieve certain positive development outcomes. But you're correct. One of the things you do see, though, is, I was in Tamale, and one of the questions that kept coming up is, when would we really see all the fruits of democracy? And it wasn't about the political things that come with democracy, the free speech, the free association, that people cherish, that people love. But they want more than just those basic political freedoms. They also want to see democracy deliver, good education, a decent and good quality healthcare, things like that. And that becomes something that democracy cannot also overlook.
Well, the conversation will definitely continue at 3 p.m. later today at the CDD Conference Room. I love conversations about democracy because it's integral to who we are and the path that we've chosen. But Dr. John Osae-Kwapong does a fantastic job by summarizing all the Afrobarometer reports that we've ever done in this country into this book that you need to receive or get a copy of. It is 5 Presidents, 8 Elections, 30 years later. I'm grateful that you could join me this morning. I'm going to get my copy and do well to get yours as well. And let's enrich our conversations on democracy in this country. That'll be it from me and the entire team. We are